So we want to start this bonus episode getting into a little listener feedback here that we received. So first, Dermot wrote in with a comment on the translation of the Sea Inside title from Mar Adentro in Spanish. And I think I do get a little too hung up on thinking that titles, quote, should be literal. Like, why would you change it? If you have a literal translation you can make, and he kind of points out that thematically it makes more sense saying, well, I said out to sea, he said maybe more actually kind of into the sea, because how they would say it in Spanish, but it's more about the spirit of the title, and then changing it in English to the sea inside is more kind of, that metaphorical thing that fits the theme of the film, versus if you just literally translated it to out to sea or into the sea, the English audience doesn't get that same connection to his own journey. You know what I'm saying? There's a connection there in Spanish that we just don't see in English if you made it a literal translation.
And you also run the risk of people thinking it's like a, high seas, like pirate drama or something. If you name it out to
no,
sea.
yeah, exactly. So
yeah, it just it works a lot better as the Sea Inside.
Yeah, I think that's probably an important thing, is that translating isn't just about word for word what does it mean. It's more about what are you trying to convey. And then he also went on, Dermot here, to point out that you definitely see the opposite, where a lot of times English titles translated into Spanish are just laughably bad, probably because they're whatever he didn't give examples, but they fail in the attempt to kind of either, I would guess either that they're too literal, or that in there trying to make it something else, it's just becomes laughable anyway. But yeah, I thought that was worth mentioning. And it is, obviously we don't have to dive into the English and translations and all that stuff in general, but there are other things that come to mind are, I've heard I forget who did this, but basically if you translate something from, say, Japanese anime into English and then back into Japanese, or the other way around, you can end up with some really, really funny things. It's just the way.
Yeah. There are some funny videos or examples of people where they, they will translate something back and forth.
Yes.
Or translate it between
a
few
degrades.
languages.
Yeah.
And then it's just absolute gibberish by the time they're done with it.
And I think it all comes down to syntax. We just take for granted, you have to even think of something as simple as, everyone in America who learns a little bit of Spanish kind of knows that sometimes the adjectives come after the noun, which is different than in English. But there's a million little things like that where the syntax is just different. So the moment you start translating, if you don't also translate the syntax, it just degrades and becomes, just like you said, just a hot mess.
Yeah. There's a few, and you can find tons of examples of this, but just absolutely hilarious title translations from English into other languages, and then
back in English, right?
And then right, but what the literal translation is, and some of them are even funnier if you know the context. So Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind in Italy, the title is, if you literally translate it into English, is "If you leave me, I delete you."
That's good. That's actually a good title.
Yeah. I think my favorite one is the Chinese title for Boogie Nights, which, unless you've seen Boogie Nights, this probably won't land. But the Chinese title, literally translated, is "His powerful device makes him famous."
Yeah, that's I don't have anything to add. I think we should just move on from that one. The other person that wrote in was Nick, and he had a movie to suggest, and I was almost kind of skeptical at first in that, okay, this is it's called The Beast or The Beast of War from 1988, and I was like, okay, yeah, it's a 1980s war movie I've never heard of. There's probably a reason I've never heard of this movie. And did you get a chance to watch it?
I did. I just watched it last night. It was so good.
It's solid. It's solid.
I'm bummed that we didn't have the opportunity, it didn't work out time-wise to be able to do this.
Oh, it's a full episode here. Yeah.
As at least a bonus episode to Charlie Wilson's War, if not its own episode.
Right,
It was that good.
No, it's now. I feel like I'm a little less enamored with it than you and Nick. At the same time, it grew on me. At the beginning, it was kind of awkward at the beginning, I thought, because at first I was like, okay, are these guys speaking English? Are these Americans? that are coming in to deal with the war between the Soviets and the Mujahideen? Or, okay, they're actually Russians that are using English as a proxy for Russian, which I feel was an 80s thing, that nowadays you would just have the Russians speak Russian. And I feel like you don't see a lot of movies nowadays where they sub languages in to that egregiously, and to the point that the audience was like, I was actually confused that these guys are speaking English. Versus nowadays, you would just...
It was cool that the Afghans were actually speaking Pashto, though.
Yes. Although I did see in one of the IMDb error things, they said some of the women were actually speaking Hindi. But no, so it was good. So at first, though, it was kind of confusing too, because I was like, who are they wanting us to root for? Because it was kind of like, you almost at first you're like, wait, so the Mujahideen, see, okay, they're justified in their anger, so they're definitely the good guys. But they're not the main characters. The Russian tank's the main character. And there's really only one of them that we like. But it was also unclear that he was really the clear protagonist at first. And it definitely became clear that he was the most protagonist.
Right, because the very first thing that you see him do in the movie is like a war crime.
Right. Now I'm getting under duress, but still.
Sure.
So it was kind of fascinating kind of figuring that out. And I was almost kind of like, wait, who are we supposed to root for here? But... then it kind of, hits its groove, and it was definitely engaging, and you're like, oh, okay, this guy that is at odds with his commanding officer who's a psychopath, that's where you're like, okay, this guy's the bad guy. Their guy in charge of the tank who is just horrible. I mean, even by Russian standards.
But even the crazy, bloodthirsty tank commander he's not just maniacally evil for no reason. Like, he talks about in the movie how he's been fighting wars since he's 8 years old. Like, he was at the siege of Stalingrad when he was 8 years old and was fighting Nazis in World War II and has been nonstop at war ever since. And obviously that's going to mess somebody up.
That's true. And I was even kind of trying to do the math in my head. And it kind of checks out because this is set in 1981. It even says at the very beginning, we're in the second year of the Russian invasion. And so that guy who's a tank commander in 1981 would have been the right age to be a little kid during World War II. And that was kind of fascinating. You think about those things as being so separate historically, World War II versus Russian invasion of Afghanistan. You don't think of any overlap, but children of World War II were then the generals and soldiers 40 years later, or even just about 40 years later. And this doesn't look like it was based on any specific incident, obviously, other than, it does deal heavily with the actual Russian invasion in Afghanistan, which we've touched on a little bit in the past. But this particular incident does just seem to be fabricated. I couldn't find anything that said anything like this actually happened.
No, it's the screenplay is based on a stage play.
Oh, right. That was cool, too.
Called Nanawati, which is like the custom of showing hospitality and mercy to people, which is kind of that's like the main theme in the movie.
And that was kind of brilliant how they worked that in, I thought. Like the whole idea that it was being set up earlier where their translator is kind of then teaching him some of these Afghani customs, and it doesn't feel out of place. It feels organic to that moment. And then when that ties back later to him, basically that's how he doesn't get killed by the Mujahideen, is he invokes that Nana Watai or whatever. I'm like, that was brilliant writing right there.
Yeah, for sure. It was also interesting watching this movie and trying to think of it as a, because in 2021
pre 9/11,
right, pre 9/11, and before a lot of people probably even knew anything about Afghanistan and how much stuff that it actually did get right as far as their language and their culture and stuff.
True, that's a good point. So the American audience that apparently didn't exist, because Nick mentions this was only released in 2 theaters across the U.S., which again does kind of blow my mind. It just must have got lost in the shuffle. Anyway, but the audience back then, I mean, you're still at the tail end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall hasn't come down yet when this movie was released. So this is almost on the heels of a Red Dawn in the 80s, where it's more just obviously the Russians are the bad guys. So the whole idea of hey, we can have one good Russian who's helping the Mujahideen, and that's completely different perspective than, again, watching this now, where...
and more than just the Berlin Wall hadn't come down, there were still Soviets in Afghanistan when this movie came out.
Oh my gosh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's contemporary. It's almost like, we say all those World War II movies that came out during World War II. It's kind of this is a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan movie while they were still there. That's a great point. Yeah. So yeah, it's a completely different perspective. Yeah, that's fascinating. So yes, do continue to write in with any listener feedback. We will admit that our audience is still small enough at this point that if you write in, there is an excellent chance we will give you a shout out on the podcast. So yeah, do continue to do that. It's a little tricky with just the recording in our timeline. This episode isn't airing until March, I don't think. We're recording it in January, right after we got the feedback. So we'll figure out a way to work it in if we can at all. So yeah, thanks for listening, and we're gonna go ahead and continue on with our discussion this Friday about American Sniper. So that was recorded much earlier. So take it away, Logan from the past.
Okay, so with this bonus episode, this was something that we had talked about specifically because of all the issues that I mentioned in the Hurt Locker episode that I had with historical accuracy and just, life in the military in general accuracy that kind of kill my suspension of disbelief. So I wanted to also talk about American Sniper, which is the movie that this episode is about.
So does it do a way better job with just as far as how the military operates?
So again, like for the specifics, like I don't know anything about EOD. Like I was never an EOD guy, so I can't speak to the stuff that is inaccurate in the Hurt Locker that's related to EOD. Also, on that same note, I've never been a Navy SEAL or a sniper. So
okay, fair.
But
you still don't have the issues with this one.
As far as if an actual Navy SEAL sniper is watching this movie, I'm sure that there is hokey stuff that they can pick apart.
Or anyone who's ever seen a human child that might recognize the lack of a human child.
Yeah, looking like honestly, like the practical effects in like The Thing from 1984, 1985 are better than the creepy plastic rubber baby in this movie.
I did see that, and we're getting off. We're side note as always, but I did see that it's because basically real baby number 1 was sick, real baby number 2 didn't show up, and it was the time to film the scene. So Clint was just like, "Get the doll in there," like.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, find another day, because you could have done that whole scene in a day and with a real baby, because it looks horrible. They said audiences were even laughing in the theaters during that scene because the baby looks so fake. All right, sorry. Anyway, back to
so with this movie, and just like any other movie that deals with the military, like there's hokey stuff and corny stuff and stuff that people are talking about that no one would actually have to talk about, but that it's like, oh, that's for the audience, like, explaining what certain acronyms and things mean. But I think that this movie does a lot better job in that department than the Hurt Locker does.
Okay, interesting. And because while I think Bradley Cooper's performance is excellent, I don't think this is a very good movie.
Okay, and I can see why people don't like this movie, for sure. I love Bradley Cooper's performance in this movie, especially because when you watch like actual interviews with Chris Kyle, because Chris Kyle was, famous and he was pretty well known like when this movie was coming out.
Okay.
So he wasn't like killed in the war or anything. For people who don't know, he would or haven't seen the movie. He was after he came back from Iraq and got out of the Navy, he started helping veterans deal with issues and deal with PTSD. And one of the ways that he would do that would take them to the range and they would go shoot with Chris Kyle, who's,
the legend.
He was the legend, this well-known Navy SEAL sniper. And one of the veterans that he and his friend were taking out to the range ended up killing both of them. So he was actually killed while this movie was in production. Or I think it was at least pre-production.
Is that why it feels so awkward at the end? Like, they should have just left it out.
Yes.
Like, they basically shoehorned an ending to a movie in a way that just, like, is so stupid. From a filmmaking standpoint, it's horrible. But
because when it was, I think it was either in production or in pre-production, because Bradley Cooper has talked about how he had spoken with Chris Kyle about, certain aspects of the movie. So the movie wasn't going to be anything about that. It was just going to be about his exploits in Iraq.
They should have just ended it however they were planning on ending it anyway. And then you could still do the text on the screen that says in 2013 he was murdered. You can say all that, but just the weird thing of showing it, and then like the wife is a little nervous about the guy who's weird. It just, from a storytelling standpoint, it's a dumb Deus Ex Machina. Now I get that it really happened, but then you have to set it up. You either leave it out completely or you set it up. You can't do half of both.
Well, and I think it's one of those things where it could have gone either way, because from the filmmaker standpoint, I can see both sides. I can see people that say just leave it out, we'll just keep it how the story was, and once he vanquishes the enemy sniper at the end, and that'll be the end. But then if all of a sudden this guy who you're making this movie about, who's already this legend, is part of this very high profile, he's trying to help veterans, and then one of them kills him, that could almost be a story in itself. And it's how do we, it's okay, well, this is obviously in the news, and we're still making this movie. How do we not talk about that? How do we not address that?
Okay. And so let's kind of then rewind to the film itself. And again, there's a lot I do like here, I would say, but then I don't know, I also feel like I want to peel the Band-Aid off and be like, despite all the things Chris Kyle did, and he was legitimately called the legend or the myth for his ability to kind of protect his guys and as a sniper over in Iraq. They make him out to be so humble in the movie, but he basically has a long track record of exaggerating things he's done, and just the comparison I always think of is John Smith, who wrote 5 volumes of his exploits that were probably mostly not true, but he also still did a lot of important stuff. So I feel like the movie makes him so humble when he was basically bragging about stuff he never did.
Yeah, there's a whole section on his Wikipedia page about alleged fabrications,
right?
Of stuff that he did.
That he went down and was sniping looters during Hurricane Katrina, and the police are like, we don't know what he's talking about. It's just so bizarre. It's if you did that, you're a criminal, and if you didn't, why would you say you did? It's bizarre. Or if you did do it, it wasn't the numbers you said. It's just a weird thing to even say, and it doesn't fit with the guy they kind of present us with in the movie. And he's kind of this weird combination too. I feel like the movie can't get straight what it's trying to say. So it's he's this proud kind of hoorah American who we can maybe kind of get behind, but then he's also not really a good husband half the time. So what message are you trying to say? Is the movie even pro this guy or anti this guy?
Yeah, but I think that's, and I don't know, maybe it's just because I have a different perspective on this, but I think that's kind of I don't think that's necessarily a negative. I mean, that's not to say, I don't know. It's showing how much he's sacrificing by showing that he's basically saying this cause, trying to save as many guys as possible, is more important than my marriage right now. That he's basically kind of biting the bullet and just saying, yes, my marriage is going to suffer. Yes, my relationship with my child is going to suffer, but this is something that I have to do.
No, I get that intellectually. It just feels like the Lifetime movie version of that. It just doesn't feel very well executed to me.
Yeah. I don't know. I've also, and I'm curious to get your take on this. There are kind of 2 factions of people when it comes to this movie. One who think that it is it's glorifying war, and specifically the Iraq war, and then others that say no, it's showing how terrible it was, and this is an anti-war movie.
Oh, I think it's 100% glorification.
Really?
Yeah. Well, but also with the caveat of it also seems inconsistent with what it's trying to do.
Okay. I think it's kind of both. I think it's trying to be an anti-war movie. But I think it ends up glorifying a lot of the aspects of the war, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's, well, again, it's just the whole idea too of, so it gets too hyperbolic. This whole idea of the rival between the snipers that I get. So he mentions this rival sniper once in the book, because it's a sniper who did kill one of his buddies. But the idea that there was this longtime rival and there's posters, that's all just, they beefed that up for the movie in a way that was not even close to what happened. He didn't kill the guy, he killed some other guy with this supposed long shot, but even then, that might have been another thing he was bragging about. But yeah, this whole sniper rivalry wasn't really a thing. And also, it just feels too superhero action movie as opposed to real life war the way they did it. Like, it's almost like it's just this hyperbole that just,
yeah.
Whereas, again, Hurt Locker, despite its issues, felt more real.
That is one issue that I do have with this movie and the way that it has this, the story of him in Iraq and then the story of him after he's out of the Navy. The stuff in Iraq, you can tell it's like, okay, this is going to be based on Chris Kyle's exploits, and we're kind of going to spice it up and make it a little more, movie
popcorny, yeah.
But then we're also going to have this really kind of heartfelt, sappy, like, this is stuff that he did when he got back. So it's like, which he did all of that stuff.
No, right.
The stuff that they show from afterwards. But it's like, but then when the first part of your movie is this stuff that's like his life, but with extra stuff added and stuff changed, it does kind of, it's a conflict between those two parts of the story.
Right. I just it couldn't decide what it was trying to be. And, so also we talk in a lot of movies, the ones we tend to like more where it kind of deals with the nuance, and we appreciate when the movies show the nuance of history. And I feel like this movie is just kind of lacking in nuance. The Iraqis are not people, and even the one guy they have dinner with ends up being an insurgent who's hoarding weapons for the bad guys. And it's like, and I guess the kid is humanized a little bit, but outside of that, it's just, you feel like it's the good guys are in this country protecting each other, and there is no questions of why are we here in the first place? What are we doing? Are there actually good Iraqis? It just seems so lacking nuance.
Right, but that's kind of by design, though, because that basically Chris Kyle and all of the characters in the movie, their viewpoint is, well, it doesn't matter. Like, we're not making any of those decisions. We're not choosing whether or not to be here, but since we are here, I'm going to do everything I can to try and save as many of my guys as possible.
No, and that's fair, and I feel like there's a world where the character can do that, but then the filmmakers show the nuance.
Yeah.
The other note I had here about the version of Kyle we get in the film, because I don't want to just rag on the real life guy, but I wrote, is he codependent? You think about people who are in codependent relationships who basically they don't exist outside of their relationship with their significant other. I feel like that was him, and maybe first it was rodeo, and then it became looking out for his guys. And yes, he wants to protect his guys, but he almost wasn't a person outside of his dedication to America. And it's like a codependent relationship with patriotism, which was just interesting, but also icky in a way.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know. I never really thought about it like that, but, and it also, and I obviously like this movie way more than you do, but I think that it might be one of those things where this is kind of like what you were talking about when we did Bill and Ted, where you love that movie way more than most people because it's like perfect time and place. So this movie, movie came out in January of 2015, and I had just gotten back from my first deployment to Afghanistan in October of 2014.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I get back from my first deployment and immediately this movie comes out. So it's like, I don't know, kind of perfect time and place for me to be feeling things and dealing with things and be in a mindset that was that was a perfect time for me to appreciate this movie to its maximum. And going back and rewatching it now, it's I don't necessarily, I don't connect with it on that level, but I think because I connected with it so much when I first saw it, that it kind of has that carryover.
That nostalgia is, I get that for sure.
Yeah.
And ultimately too, I do say, so it's a 72% on Rotten Tomatoes, which again, we should remind everybody is just the percentage of critics that gave it a thumbs up versus a thumbs down. So 28 gave it a down, 72 gave it up. If I had to pick, I'd probably give it a very, very tepid thumbs up. But yeah, if I'm rating it, I'm probably putting it at a 6 out of 10 or a 6.5 out of 10.
Because it is a 7.3 on IMDb, which we always talk about the issues with the IMDb rating system, but it's a pretty high rating. It's relatively high.
That's solid. Yeah. And then an 84% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, and it was nominated for 6 Oscars, including Best Picture. So, and again, I don't hate it. I just have several issues with it. But it's solid, and Bradley Cooper's performance alone is worth watching the whole movie. He is awesome. He becomes Chris Kyle for this movie. If you go watch interviews with Chris Kyle and then you watch Bradley Cooper in this movie, interesting.
It's crazy. He's so good. And also, and this is like a little side note about his performance, but that scene where he's like working out and he's got like the super loud metal music blaring in his headphones, and he's got like the trap bar deadlift and he's doing like 500 pounds or whatever, just repping it out. He actually did. That was real weight.
Oh, Bradley Cooper really did that?
Yeah, that he like I read this article with the guy who was like his trainer for the movie, and he said that he wanted on screen he wanted it to look like he was actually repping out 400 whatever pounds that was. And because he said it's going to look fake if we have like fake weights on there. If it's only like 100 pounds, it's not going to look the same. So he wanted it to look real. So he like worked his way up to be able to do that. And so that shot that you see in the movie of him working out, that's real weight.
Interesting. And we talked about that with Hurt Locker, where I get annoyed with running. Weightlifting is another one. Like you'll see this occasionally. It drives me crazy. Someone will be bench pressing and they'll hold it about halfway up for like 10 seconds. It's like, no, that's not a thing. After 3 seconds, you're either getting it or you're not getting it. There is no holding it for 10 seconds. That's not a thing. You can make slow progress, but you can't hold it halfway struggling for 10 seconds. You just physiologically can't do it. So you definitely notice those kind of things, or if the weight just doesn't look right too. But again, it's just kind of things you are used to. The one other note I had here, and this is kind of a side thing, but was that a real gun he was pointing at his wife at the end, like the revolver? It looked real, and he's pointing it at his wife. When he was just doing like a little play thing, just like, hey, stick him up, missy. But it looked like a real gun.
Yeah, that looks like a real gun.
Right. That's kind of 101 is never point a gun at somebody, loaded or not. I'm not a gun owner, but never point a gun at anything you don't plan on shooting.
Oh, yeah, no, that's a no-no.
That's like, yeah. And maybe a sniper might know better.
In the movie, he's very obviously just messing around.
Correct. But the rule is never point a gun at something you don't plan on killing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so you were going to talk about then Iraq.
Yeah. So last week we kind of ended around 2004 because that's when the movie takes place. But I did want to kind of just talk about, or just touch on basically what's happened with the Iraq War and in Iraq between 2004 and now.
Okay.
And not to go too crazy in depth, but basically after the U.S. overthrew Saddam, there was huge civil war, and so you have warring factions within Iraq fighting each other and fighting the United States, as well as terrorist organizations that were in Iraq fighting the United States. One of which was the Islamic State, or the Islamic State in Iraq, or ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or sometimes called ISIL, which is the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. So they were one of the terrorist organizations that I think they were actually initially funded by Saudi Arabia. They're no longer have any connection to Saudi Arabia, but they were in kind of western Iraq on the border with Syria. And in 2010, when the Arab Spring happened, Bashar al-Assad kind of refused to give up power in Syria, so they got involved in the Syrian civil war, but really they were trying to use it as a way to, the region was already destabilized, so they were trying to capitalize on that to start their own caliphate in Syria and Iraq. And they were like kind of at war with everybody. It's honestly too insane to go over. It could be an entire series of podcasts, like the relationships between the different people that were there, like who was supporting and helping and who's against who in that conflict area in like the early to mid 2010s. But like I remember seeing, and I don't know if this was like on a website somewhere or if it was like something that I saw, when I was in the Marine Corps, but basically it was like they was like circles that were representing like different countries and different organizations. So there's like a circle for the United States and a circle for the Iraqi government and a circle for the Kurds and a circle for Syrian rebels and for the Syrian government and for ISIS and Turkey and Russia and China. And it was like, several dozen circles of all these organizations and then colored lines showing this person supports this person, but they're against this person. And this person is against these people, but they're also helping these people who are against these people, but these guys are helping these guys. And so it's like this.
It's Game of Thrones.
Huge basically, yeah. Huge mess. Yeah, so ISIS has lost most of its, since then, ISIS has lost most of its territory. It does still exist, but most of its actual territory is gone now. But they're, when they were first kind of come into power, basically in 2013, 2014, it's like all of the money that we spent, like tens of billions of dollars that we spent on the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military, it was almost like a complete waste because of corruption and desertion and, disbanding of military units, like in Iraq itself, that a lot of times would just give up without a fight because why try and resist? Like, we know we're going to get our asses kicked. We know that, I'm either going to get killed or get captured and then get killed. So what's the point? And so there was, basically it showed kind of the futility of the last 10 years of conflict in the region. And that was all, I'm not an expert by any means, but it seems to me that would have been a lot harder for any of that to happen had the United States not invaded Iraq in 2003.
Right.
And
right.
I completely understand that the Saddam Hussein regime was horrible and they did horrible things and he needed to be out of power. That, obviously everyone has a right to govern their own lives and govern their own future, and he was super oppressive and violent. But it's like we talked about in the Hurt Locker episode, it was a stability thing.
Right. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Right.
So today in Iraq, I mean, you haven't been to Iraq yet, I don't think, but like, what is life like?
There's still a military presence there.
Right. What is life like for the daily or for the regular Iraqi citizen, I guess? Are they getting to vote in elections and it's just still dealing with corrupt governments? And so it's.
I think it is. It's essentially. The government itself is stable-ish, but there are still terrorist organizations operating there. There's still, ISIS is still around. There's like Iranian-backed terrorist groups there too. Obviously, earlier this year, which a lot of people forget about, between COVID and the George Floyd protests that are going on right now, that at the beginning of this year, back in January, we came
last year.
Oh, right. At the beginning of last year, because this is 2021. In January of 2020, we came really close to a conflict with Iran because, there was the Iranian general was killed, and that was in Baghdad. So there is still even though the United States hasn't been doing, sustained combat operations in Iraq for a while, there is still a military presence there.
Yeah, so it's a mess, and it's something hopefully that you want what's best for the people involved, and it's just tricky when you have so many different factions that ultimately want their say, and if they're willing to resort to violence over the ballot box, I think that just causes so many problems, which again, we're recording 3 months before an American election where you feel like some people wouldn't mind a little violence to get what they want. So you just want to make sure we don't go down that road and that level heads always prevail. And yeah, that's kind of probably about all we need to say about Iraq. And I don't think we'll be dealing with the war on terror anymore in our world history line here. So yeah, we'll be back to our regularly scheduled program next week.